All right, so today we're diving headfirst into the world of AI.
Head first.
Into those large language models everyone and their dog seems to be talking about.
Yeah,
and
it's everywhere you look these days.
it really is. And the sources you've sent in are fascinating. It's everything from OpenAI's announcement about their new reasoning model series,
Right.
to research papers, even notes on explaining AI to like 7-year-olds. So clearly you want to understand not just what these things are,
Yeah.
but why everyone's so hyped about them.
Absolutely. It's like you've assembled the perfect AI starter kit.
I like to
We've got all the bases covered.
Yeah, so let's start with OpenAI's big reveal, their new reasoning model series, OpenAI O1.
Okay.
They're making some pretty bold claims about O1, saying these models are practically geniuses compared to the previous versions, especially when it comes to those complex tasks.
Yeah.
In science, coding, math, you name it.
And what's really interesting is they're not just saying it's a bit better. They're actually claiming it can perform on par with PhD students in certain scientific benchmarks
I remember reading that. Yeah.
and even tackle problems from the International Math Olympiad, which is something earlier models really struggled with.
Which is huge, right? Because they specifically called that out, that it couldn't do that before.
Exactly.
And now it's like, hold my beer.
Yeah, they're setting a new standard, not just for themselves, but for the whole field of AI.
Yeah. It feels like they're moving the goalposts for everybody.
Absolutely. And they're not just stopping there either. They're releasing 2 versions, O1 Preview and O1 Mini, each kind of fine-tuned for different needs and user bases.
So it's like they've got the whole O1 family now.
Exactly.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves,
Yeah.
I love that you included those charts about explaining AI to kids.
Right.
Because I think they're a great way to kind of bring it back to the basics of how these language models actually work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sometimes those simplified explanations can be surprisingly insightful.
Yeah.
Like that super message decoder analogy you highlighted.
Yeah.
Really captures the essence of how these models are processing information.
Right.
Breaking down language into these smaller digestible chunks that it can then understand.
Yeah, it's like they can take a sentence and dissect it, figure out what each word, or even what parts of each word actually mean.
Yeah, and how they all fit together.
And how they all go together.
Yeah, that process of breaking down the language is called tokenization.
Right.
And it's a really fundamental concept for how these large language models,
LLM.
or LMs as we often call them,
Yeah.
interpret and generate text.
Right.
It's about giving them the building blocks of language so they can actually work with them.
Right.
Yeah.
So if tokenization is giving it the building blocks,
Yeah,
the super message decoder you mentioned is like the master builder, then figuring out how to...
exactly.
Yeah.
It's taking those blocks and it's using a mechanism called attention to focus on specific parts of the input,
Okay.
like shining a spotlight on different words or phrases to understand the relationships and the context.
So instead of just looking at it like one big blob of language, it can pick and choose what it's paying attention to.
Precisely. And that attention mechanism is what allows it to go beyond just predicting the next word in a sentence. It can actually start to grasp the nuances of human language.
And the more data they're fed, the better they get at using that attention to
Yeah.
figure things out.
Exactly. It's like us learning and improving over time. The more experience these models have,
Right.
the better they become at understanding and responding
Yeah.
to even the most complex prompts.
It's not just about the quantity, though, right? It's also got to be quality data
Absolutely.
and structured in a way that makes sense.
You said that's where things get really interesting,
Okay.
because it's not enough to just throw a ton of text at these models.
Yeah.
You have to think about how that text is prepared and presented. And that's where the Hugging Face source you shared comes in.
Right.
You talk about these specialized tokenizers, which are super important, especially when you're training a model from scratch.
So it's like choosing the right tools for the right job.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
The choice of tokenizer can really impact a model's performance, especially when you're dealing with really niche areas like scientific literature or code.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think this suggests that OpenAI had to make some really deliberate choices when they were designing O1 in its training process.
It's like they were baking a very specific cake,
Exactly.
which kind of leads to my next question, actually.
Okay.
We've been talking about LLMs in general,
Right.
but what makes O1 a reasoning model? What makes this thing different?
Yeah, it's about taking all those elements we've already talked about. The tokenization, the attention, the whole super message decoder idea,
Yeah.
and kind of dialing them up to 11.
Okay.
OpenAI is claiming that O1 doesn't just predict the next word in a sentence. like some LLMs might. It actually spends more time thinking through the problem.
So it's not just a faster decoder, it's like a totally different way of processing things.
That's what they seem to be suggesting, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between recognizing a pattern and actually understanding the logic behind it.
Okay, so how does that actually work then?
So imagine that attention spotlight we talked about, but instead of just highlighting words, it can hold multiple ideas or steps in its mind at the same time. So it's evaluating different paths before it even gets to an answer.
Wow. Okay, so if it's doing all that extra thinking,
Yeah.
doesn't that mean there's more potential for things to go off the rails?
Right. It's a fair point, and it's definitely something that OpenAI is thinking about.
Yeah, because we've all seen those sci-fi movies where the AI gets a little too smart.
Right. And it's not just science fiction anymore. It's a real concern. And OpenAI has actually dedicated a big chunk of their announcement to the safety aspects of O1.
Right. They're saying it's way better at resisting those jailbreaking attempts.
Exactly. Those tricks people try to use to bypass the safety protocols and get the AI to go off script.
Which seems to be happening more and more these days.
Yeah, it's a constant cat and mouse game. And it's a big deal, not just from a technical standpoint, but also for public perception.
Right. If people are going to trust AI to do important things.
Exactly. They need to know that it's safe and reliable.
So how does OpenAI plan on proving that O1 is up to the task?
Well, for one, they've partnered up with both the US and UK AI safety institutes.
I was going to ask about that because that seems like a pretty big deal.
It is. It shows they're serious about transparency and getting independent verification of their safety claims.
So it's not just OpenAI saying, trust us, it's all good.
Exactly. They're bringing in outside experts to kick the tires and make sure everything's on the up and up.
Okay, so that addresses the safety concerns, but I have to admit, as I was going through those research papers you sent, I couldn't shake this feeling. Is O1 really this groundbreaking leap forward?
Okay.
Or is it more like they took what was already out there and just gave it a massive upgrade?
You hit the nail on the head. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It feels like a lot of AI advancements are like building on what came before.
Absolutely.
Instead of reinventing the wheel every time.
AI research is very much about building upon previous breakthroughs, refining techniques, scaling them up. And in your notes, you highlighted some key concepts like fine-tuning, transfer learning, few-shot learning.
Yeah, those all stood out to me.
These are all well-established techniques that have been really important in moving LLMs forward.
Right, like fine-tuning a pre-trained model to make it better at a specific task.
Exactly.
Or transfer learning, where you take what the model's learned in one area and apply it to something totally different.
Precisely. And then you have few-shot learning, which is super interesting because it allows models to learn new things from just a handful of examples.
It's just kind of how we learn as humans.
Right, exactly. It's like showing a child a few pictures of a cat and suddenly they can recognize any cat.
And OpenAI's own GPT-3 was already really good at that few-shot learning stuff.
It was very impressive.
So is O1 just building on all of that, leveraging tons of data and processing power?
It's possible.
Or is there something fundamentally different about how they've approached these reasoning models?
That's the big question.
That is the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like O1 is this big mystery box.
It really is.
And we're trying to figure out if it's full of brand new amazing stuff,
Right,
or just a really well-organized version of what we've already seen.
And the answer is probably somewhere in between.
Okay.
Like we were saying, AI progress usually builds on what came before.
Right.
It's about taking those existing techniques, refining them, scaling them up. And OpenAI isn't claiming to have cracked the code of like true artificial general intelligence.
Right. They're not saying it's sentient or anything.
Exactly. But they might be pushing the limits of what we thought was possible with the tech we have now.
It's still a pretty big deal if they've managed to make those kinds of leaps.
Absolutely. Remember those comparisons to PhD level work in the Olympiad problems?
Yeah, it's not like those are easy feats.
Even if they've just refined existing methods, those refinements seem to be producing some really impressive results.
And they don't seem to be shying away from the hype either. They even called the O1 series resetting the counter back to 1.
That's a very deliberate choice of words.
It really is. What do you think they meant by that?
Well, it tells me they see O1 as a turning point, a foundation for everything that comes next in AI.
So it'll be really interesting to see where they go from here.
Absolutely. Will future models in the O series be built on a totally new architecture? Or will they just keep scaling up this approach with even more data and processing power?
It's like they've set this new starting line.
Exactly.
And now everyone's watching to see who will cross it first.
And how they'll do it.
Right, because they're not keeping all of this locked away in a vault either.
No, they're not.
OpenAI is making O1 available in so many ways. ChatGPT Plus, team subscriptions, even their API. And they said it's going to be in the free version of ChatGPT eventually.
It's a really fascinating release strategy.
It is, because it feels like it's about more than just money.
I think you're right. By controlling how quickly and how widely O1 gets adopted, they can keep a close eye on how it's being used out in the wild.
So it's almost like a giant controlled experiment.
In a way, yes.
With the future of AI.
And everyone gets a front row seat.
That's a pretty exciting and maybe a little bit terrifying thought.
A bit of both, perhaps. But that's the thing about technology, especially something as powerful as AI.
It always comes with big questions.
About safety ethics, the future of work. Things we need to keep talking about.
And I'm sure we'll be doing exactly that right here on the Deep Dive.
Absolutely. This is just the beginning.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the world of OpenAI and O1.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been fascinating.
Until next time.
Stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you on my next video. Ciao, my friends.